All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome back to the Science Sessions. We have 4 more outstanding presentations scheduled today, 2 in the next hour and then 2 more starting at 3:30. To remind everyone, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit written questions as they come to mind during the presentations. And then when the speakers are done with their presentations, we'll get those questions answered. So let's get to it. First up is Joe LIEBEZEIT. Joe has worked for Portland Audubon since 2013, acting as the staff scientist, and he leads their community science and coastal conservation programs. Joe received his bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of New Hampshire and a master's degree in wildlife management from Humboldt State University. Joe's work crosses conservation science, policy, and outreach disciplines. And today he will be speaking about avian response to habitat restoration at a wastewater treatment facility in Oregon. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. Thanks again. And I really appreciate the Western Field Ornithologists accepting the abstract for this presentation. I look forward to chatting with you today about this site, Fernhill Wetlands, and the restoration that happened there and how the birds responded. Before I do that, I just want to thank my co-authors, CANDACE LARSON. She's our field biologist. She was instrumental to the project. JAY WITHGOTT helped get this whole thing started a number of years ago. And Jay was a past board member at Audubon, and he'll be talking after me. So you hear more from Jay. Carol Murdock with Clean Water Services. Clean Water Services is the municipal agency that owns that owns Fernhill Wetlands, and they provided funding for this. And finally, John PLISSNER, it helped with a lot with the statistical analysis, and he is a Fish and Wildlife employee, but he did this on his own time. And I really want to thank mostly all the community scientists, citizen scientists that helped collect data for this project using eBird, which I'll talk about more up next. So for those of you who don't know where Fernhill Wetlands are, they are located west of Portland. You can see Portland here in the middle of the map. Columbia River, the blue ribbon here. And Fernhill Wetlands is circled here. So within a region-wide context, Fernhill is part of a complex of green spaces in the Portland metro area and provides habitat connectivity for migratory birds traveling the Pacific Flyway. And it was designated as an important bird area a number of years ago by Audubon. And Fernhill has been an important birder destination for many years. So this is what the site looks like, what it looked like prior to restoration. It's a 90-acre site, again, maintained by Clean Water Services. And prior to restoration, you can see here it consisted of these large holding ponds of mostly open water, originally built in the 1940s for wastewater treatment, but had not been utilized since 1972. And water levels were left unmaintained up until the restoration process started. And so why did Clean Water Services want to go about and create this, what they call a natural treatment system at Fernhill? And basically their goals were to have a kind of a win-win situation where you create native wetland habitat to do what they needed to do to meet the needs of the county is the cool water, remove nutrients from the water before it goes back into the Tualatin River. But they also were hoping to have benefit wildlife from this. And also they needed to meet the demand of growing surrounding communities in the Portland metro area. And ultimately they wanted to save themselves money and save taxpayers money because green infrastructure can be cheaper than a hard infrastructure for treating wastewater. And natural treatment systems are nothing new. They've been around for probably since the 70s or so at different wastewater treatment facilities that have used this similar way to treat water. Here's a few examples in the Northwest in this photo here. What I am not aware of are if anything in the primary published literature that has documented an avian response to these types of restoration efforts. And that's what we hope to do with this work we did for this project. So here's a view of the site, an aerial view looking south. You can see what were the holding ponds here in the distance. And this site was, the major restoration work happened June 2014 to February 2015. And here's a view of the site looking to the west. And again, the site, this is right after the restoration major work was done. It's before the emergent habitat started to grow in. And you can see no more holding ponds, but there was one large pond left in addition to these kind of sinuous ponds. So it took a pretty big effort. They had totally resculpted, recontoured the site. They put in a lot of different water control structures and piping, planted hundreds of thousands of native plants and billions of seeds, and put in these logs and snags for habitat. And this is where Portland Audubon got involved. Clean Water Services asked us to work with the community and work with our staff to monitor the bird response. And the main objectives we came up with were to document avian diversity and abundance changes pre and post restoration, document bird use changes through time as the site restored and the vegetation matured, at least for 5 years, and then evaluate community science data as a tool to measure ecological response to the habitat restoration. And one important thing I should point out with the study is we did not get involved in conducting what I'll be talking about next is the professional level surveys until after the restoration was complete. Ideally, it would have been great to do this for several years before the restoration, but that's just the way it worked out. And we do have access to eBird data that was collected prior to restoration. And so I'll be talking more about how we utilize that data. But first, I'll talk about some of our predictions. Because the site shifted from this kind of open water habitat to a more diverse and complex wetland habitat, we expected the bird response to reflect that. So basically, we break it down in these kind of winning bird species. Marsh birds like rails and herons, we expected to do well. And wetland associated songbirds like red-winged blackbirds, we expected to respond well to the more complex habitat. Whereas things like wintering grebes and gulls that depend on open water, we expected to decline over time. And then there were some species we just weren't quite sure, like dabbling ducks, how exactly they would respond. So getting into their methodology a little bit here. For the community science surveys, we did have volunteers collect data using eBird. And as I mentioned before, the site had been, as a popular birding destination before we did this project. And we knew that the birders typically follow this route around the wetlands. This is the yellow line here you see. So we developed a protocol, a pretty simple one that pretty much anyone could use based on what people had done before. And of course, we added things like, minimizing double counting birds and assigning birds to the right area. And trying to tighten up the data quality. And we did need to create 2 new eBird hotspots at the site. Historically, prior to this project, there was one hotspot. So if birders went there and they did their added their checklist, they only had one hotspot that included both the natural treatment area and the area outside it. So we split that into allowing people to include the birds in their checklist for just the restored area in one checklist and outside it in the other. And then of course, this data was very useful for our pre and post restoration analysis. We did try to control data quality by, we allowed any volunteer who wanted to be as inclusive as we could to go and do surveys. But when we downloaded the data from eBird, we only used data from experienced observers that use the protocol and that served they had a minimum of 1 hour and other criteria as well to try to control for data quality. And then post-restoration, starting in the fall of 2015, we had some Portland Audubon staff folks and contractor conduct professional surveys at the site. And we established a transect kind of bisecting the site. You can see here with this red line. Those surveys we did 10 times every week for the fall and spring periods. And the eBird data was collected year round. So we only had funding to do the intensive surveys during the fall and spring. So talking a little bit about our analysis methods, we did the pre-restoration, the pre-restoration period data we used was, again, just eBird data from 2010 to 2013. And prior to 2010, there wasn't a whole lot of eBird data collected at the site. But after that, there was a fair amount. During the restoration itself, of course, we couldn't do any surveys because of all the heavy equipment there. And then post-restoration, we tried to target for 5 years post-restoration, so 2015 to 2020. Our response variables, pretty basic. We wanted to look at bird richness and diversity and species abundance, which we measured by detections per survey. With respect to these covariates treatment, pre and post restoration, and then annual and seasonal differences. And then we compare the eBird and professional line transect data as well using a t-test method. You can see these pictures here below and how much the site can change just within one season. This was particularly true right after the restoration happened and as the vegetation was rapidly growing. So I'll just jump right here into some of the results and just orient you to the slide first. So the years are on the x-axis, and in this particular slide is species richness. So we measured that by the mean number of species detected per survey. And you can see for what our basic result here is that species richness was significantly higher post-restoration versus the pre-restoration period. And there was a bit of a lag the first few years, but then things really took off after that in terms of increasing richness. Looking at bird abundance, and I'll walk you through how to interpret these kind of busy slides, which will be the next couple of slides here. Again, the seasons are on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the number of birds detected per survey, which was our measure of abundance. And any of the bars that are kind of bluish in color, gradient of blue, are pre-restoration, and the ones that are yellow to red are post-restoration. And our basic finding, and again, this is eBird data, is that overall abundance with all seasons combined, we had significantly higher post-restoration compared to pre-restoration abundances. And when examined per season, only summer and fall seasons had significantly more birds detected in the post-restoration period. And you also notice that for both the fall and the winter, you see a lot more birds detected in both pre and post-restoration periods. And that's driven mostly by cackling geese, which numbered there in high numbers in the winter where they wintered. When we removed those from the analysis and looked at the data separately without them, we still had a significant post-restoration abundance increase. So this is looking at the professional surveys. Before I was focusing on the eBird surveys. So here we are the professional surveys for just the post-restoration period. And like the eBird data, we did find a significant increase in species richness just for those fall and spring periods where we had data collected. And that's in the top graph you can see here. The bottom chart, we found that unlike the eBird results, we did not find a significant effect. We found a lot more variability, but we did see kind of both for fall and spring, they were trending towards positive. And I think the spring estimate, even though it wasn't statistically significant, it was close. Things really jumped out when we looked at individual species. So this is a really good example here. And this is the Virginia rail. If you look at the top graph here, this is the eBird data. And you can see post-restoration, those orange to red bars are much, much higher abundances than pre-restoration. That was true for these other species you see listed here. And of course, those are the birds that we predicted to do well with the restoration. And the other thing I want to point out here too is that in the lower graph is the professional level surveys, the transect data, which matched up pretty well to the eBird data. You can see the spring result post-restoration to the spring eBird and the fall comparably as well. So for those species we call the loser species, or the species that wouldn't do as well post-restoration, the ones that depend on open water, gulls and terns, and grebes, in particular Western Clark grebe. Again, you can see they met the prediction of not being as common. And these are, these aren't earth-shattering results, but I think the key thing here is that we can quantify the changes and look at things like lag times of effect after the restoration to help inform management of these sites. Finally, just want to look at the eBird versus professional survey data comparison. And the top graph here is looking at species richness. And we found that the species richness estimate during the eBird surveys was significantly higher when compared to the professional surveys. And there could be a number of explanations for this. I mean, you saw back at the methods, the survey routes were pretty different between the eBird survey routes and the transect that bisected the site. So that could play a role in viewability of the site and so forth in affecting that result. Despite that, they did track annually pretty well the changes in species richness for both surveys. When we looked at species abundance, and it's the lower graph here, we found that the eBird versus professional surveys were not significantly different for most of the individual species comparisons, suggesting that there's some compatibility between the two methods. So I guess in conclusion, overall, we did find an increase in species richness at the site post-restoration for both of the data sets we had. We did find an overall bird abundance increase post-restoration that was, significant for the eBird data, but not for the transect data. We did see those dramatic shifts for some individual species, and most of them fit the predictions that we expected. And the eBird versus professional results, professional survey results were mixed, but both data sets are valuable in informing our findings and informing the site management for clean water services as they move forward with this work. And finally, I just want to kind of draw the bigger picture, the kind of policy piece to this. At Portland Audubon, a lot of our work is trying to translate science into convincing decision makers to move forward with conservation on the ground. In this particular project, we look at as a good case study that demonstrates green infrastructure solutions to deal with wastewater treatment, which can have multiple benefits for both birds and people. And so I guess with that, I'll close out my presentation. And if there's time for questions, I can answer some now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Really interesting results. And we have a question here. Can you describe the methodology of the professional line transect lake surveys?
Yes, we used line transect survey to do that. And we also established some point count stations as well. So we did both point counts and line transect surveys. And the lake survey, we used an area search method. So we would, after we would do the line transect and the point counts, we'd come back to the lake and do a scan with the scope across the whole lake and then walk around it to pick up any birds. And then we combine the data from the lake transect, the lake area search survey and the line transect survey that would represent the whole site of all the birds seen during an individual survey. We did not use the point count data. We looked at the point count data in comparison to the transect data, and we found that our estimates for transect data seem to include more species and more detections. It's probably likely because we're walking through the site and you're able to count birds as you're flushing them in some places. Whereas the point count data, you're in one spot. And so we went with the line transect data. We did collect the point count data as well, because for future project with Clean Water Services, they may want to compare this site to other surrounding green space sites where they're doing counts. And also the municipal, one of the other government agencies here in Portland area, Metro, they use point counts as well. So we figured it would be important to collect that data as well, in case it wants to be looked at a larger scale at some point.
All right, and were all species, waterbird and songbirds, recorded during the point counts?
Yes, every bird was detected during the point counts, everything.
Were there any changes in dabbling duck numbers pre and post restoration?
Yeah, I have to pull up that data in front of me, but I know for some species, we did not see a significant effect. Some we did. I'm pretty sure mallards showed an increase, but then others not. So it just depended on the species.
All right, and I apologize if I missed this, but is this wetland complex, is it a component of the wastewater treatment process? So did it replace some more sterile wastewater
Yeah, so the site was a wastewater treatment facility back a long time ago, and then was not for a while. And then Clean Water Services decided that they needed an extra facility to deal with the increasing demand because the population's growing in the area. So they decided to reboot this site, but then use that natural treatment system and that natural vegetation to help treat the water before they put it back into the river. Yeah.
And where I'm going with this, do you have any idea of the relative cost, for example, of maintenance of something like this versus, again, the more, I'll say the more sterile or more traditional?
I don't know, Steve. That would be a question for Clean Water Services. But I do know that their goal was to decrease costs for them, like I said earlier in the presentation, for themselves and for taxpayers. And I know that at other sites, there's been a demonstrated savings in money when you use a natural treatment system versus hard infrastructure. I don't know the details about that. So, yeah.
Well, you can see where I'm going. If there's a reduction in cost for maintenance and it helps the birds, then that
absolutely, yeah,
absolutely catches on.
Yeah.
And then one other question from the audience: was there any grading done on the ponds to alter pond depths?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the details of the, I wish I had Carol with me here. She could answer those kind of questions about the restoration effort and specifically. Jay Withgott was involved, so maybe Jay can say something if he knows, but I don't know I don't know the answer to that question. I know that that large pond was retained to benefit some of the open water species, and also because I think the birding community there wanted to have some large area remaining for them to go birding and to see a more diverse species.
All right. And Jay, do you know the answer to that question?
Yes, I believe there were some changes in the grading made. In particular, what the birding community was interested in was that they retain some habitat for shorebirds in particular, and that's been kind of a mixed bag. But yes, there is still some shorebird habitat here.
All right. Well, thanks, and Joe, thanks a lot. Very
interesting.
Yeah,
no problem. I appreciate it. Thanks again for the invite.
All right. Yep. And so this was a good segue because Jay Withgott happens to be our next speaker. Jay is a textbook author in environmental science with training in ecology and evolutionary biology and a lifelong passion for birds and birding. Jay is a former WFO board member, and he's also served on the board of Portland Audubon, and he's now on the board of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Jay will be speaking with us today about activities of the Oregon Bird Records Committee since 2015. So thanks for being here, Jay.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve. Let me share my screen here. And okay, is everyone able to see this okay and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Whoops. To my knowledge, no one in the Oregon Bird Records Committee has, to this point, ever made a presentation to WFO. And so our secretary, TERESA HERTZEL, and myself wanted to take this opportunity to share with you some of the highlights from the last 6 years from our committee, because this has been an especially active time in our committee's history. So, Oregon Bird Records Committee has been around for 43 years. Shortly after our establishment in 1978, we became a committee of Oregon field ornithologists, now renamed as Oregon Birding Association, when that organization was first created. We're made up of 9 full voting members, anywhere of up to 5 alternate members who can serve as substitutes, and extra folks for discussion and review, as well as our secretary. We have an online voting system of up to 3 rounds for any given record, and we meet once a year annually. And increasingly that, these days, the annual meeting, like everything else, has been virtual. And so here we are putting our best faces forward for the Zoom meeting, or perhaps not our best faces. So over the past 6 years, we've had 22 people rotating in and out of membership of the committee, which has been so we've had some turnover. We've had, so it's a nice combination now of experienced veterans and some really great, fresh new talent. We've also had a transition in our secretary. Our longtime secretary, Harry Niels, stepped down in 2016, and TERESA HERTZEL took the reins. And so we've come, as I said, into a period, a really active period of growth and development. And with our secretarial transition, TERESA has really helped bring us into the 21st century technologically and logistically. We've got some really streamlined, efficient voting procedures now, a much improved website. So that's all been great. And in terms of some policy changes on the for the committee, we've adopted term limits. We've started making annual presentations at the OBA meetings to better connect with the birding community in Oregon. We've started entering all OBRC records into eBird. We've also started reviewing a list of selected subspecies as well as species. And the thing I want to focus on really is what we've started doing is to really step up our transparency and accessibility of documentation for all our records with the public. So at this point, all photos, videos, and audio documentation for all records for the 43 years are available online to anyone who wants to take a look. We are in the process of also making all written documentation for all records for the 43 years also publicly available. And this past year, we've taken the step also of beginning to make member comments on all the accepted records also available for public view. So we're taking these steps as, in an effort to increase transparency and accessibility for the community, also as kind of an educational tool to let people have a peek into the process and see how the decision making actually works. And so this is very much in kind of still a work in progress, but I'd urge you to check out the website and see what we're in the process of doing. So now on to the birds, which I'm sure is what everyone's here for. In the past 6 years, we have added 14 species to our state list in Oregon. I'll take you on a quick tour through some of the highlights. Some birds were coming from Asia. For instance, red-flanked bluetail and dusky thrush were both backyard birds, actually. Both of them with access issues for birders, unfortunately. In fact, the dusky thrush was never even seen by anyone in the birding community at large because the word just got out too late. But luckily, the homeowner took a diagnostic photo, so that was good. With the Eurasian skylark, we have, that was a 2-day bird in the dunes in the South Jetty at Newport on the Central Coast. We were hoping to see if we could determine subspecies to try to get at potential geographic origin to see, was this a bird coming from the small Vancouver Island population, or was it coming all the way from Asia? We weren't able to do that, unfortunately, but most recently, the Oriental greenfinch, one of the few lower 48 records, showed up on the Central Coast in Florence. With a bird like this, you always want to be careful about questions of provenance. With this particular bird, taking into account seasonality, location, plumage, behavior, everything we could try to piece together, we were moderately satisfied it was probably a wild bird. Moving on, some of the records were birds from the eastern part of the continent. So great crested flycatcher. This is getting back to 2015 now, but that was our first and only record for that species. More recently, a winter wren spent part of the winter in a forest in Corvallis among many Pacific wrens, vocalizing nicely the whole time. So it was a pretty well documented, apparently pure, not hybrid winter wren. Perhaps of most interest, 2 eastern bluebirds spent one winter in Portland, and not even a male and a female, but apparently by plumage 2 male birds. So that was quite a thrill for many people getting to see those birds. Last September, we had 2 additions to the state list within just 3 days of each other, and both by the same team of birders. The dynamic duo of Shawneen Finnegan and Dave Irons found this yellow-bellied flycatcher at the Fields Oasis, a prime migrant trap out in the desert, high desert by Malheur. And then just 3 days later, they were at Goose Island State Park, or Goose Lake State Park, where just literally apparently 30 feet or so north of the California state line, they found this Arctic type warbler. This is actually our first Philoscopus warbler of any type for Oregon. It could not be identified to species because, as you may know, this taxonomic trio of birds that was split recently into Arctic warbler, Kamchatka leaf warbler, and Japanese leaf warbler is very difficult to tell apart. Peter Pyle gave a great talk on this at WFO several years ago. This bird was not vocalizing, and so neither the observers nor we, the committee, were able to get it down to species. Probably Arctic warbler, but there you go. Interestingly enough, and by the way, this was not just a one-day wonder, this was about a 10-second wonder. Shawneen recognized the bird immediately, given her experience in the Arctic. And Dave was very quick with the camera, got off this one photo, luckily, because then the bird was never seen again. But just a few days later, we had our second Arctic type warbler record, this one from the coast, found by Phil Pickering, also photographed. So now we've got 2 records. And incidentally, Dave and Shawneen went on to find our 12th Canada warbler just a few days after these birds. So they had quite the week last year in September. Moving on to boobies, which have really, as in California, Washington, we've seen just a huge increase in number of booby sightings off the coast, undoubtedly related to warmer waters due to climate change. Our first Nazca booby record was in 2015. Some of you in the audience know of this record and were even involved with it. This bird was taken in Newport at the Fish and Wildlife Service office there, taken to the Oregon Aquarium, then eventually transported for rehab down to the to the International Bird Rescue Center in San Pedro, California, where Kimball Garrett helped work on this bird to get the identification right. And then it was eventually released and off San Diego, or was released and then was seen by a boatload of pelagic birders off San Diego, apparently. So this bird had quite the adventurous story behind it. Since that time, we've had 2 other Nazca booby records, one dead on the beach and one from a cruise ship. And with these birds, all of our booby records, as well as a masked booby record, I want to thank Peter Pyle for his input on those, as well as thanking Kimball for the work on that bird down in San Pedro. And also Mary Curtis of Fish and Wildlife Service has done genetic analyses on these boobies and confirmed genetically identification as Nazca, because these are subadults where differentiation from masked booby is very difficult. Moving on to red-footed booby, our first 2 records there, both came in 2019. Again, one at sea and on a fishing boat, and one dead on the beach that was unfortunately died the next day. And then to wrap up here, just with kind of a grab bag, we had the common scoter in 2016, which was, I believe, the second mainland North American record. And then and that followed shortly, followed the Crescent City bird in California. And then we had zone-tailed hawk in the southern tier of the state that was perhaps overdue, perhaps overlooked before now, but 2018, our first record. And then of interest to me, Woodhouse's scrub jay, our first kind of confirmed, accepted record came from specimens in the Smithsonian Museum collected way back in 1921. You see here, the two top birds are determined to be woodhouses compared with some California scrub jays down below. And this is one of those taxonomic pairs, along with Plumbeus vireo and Cassin's vireo and Cordilleran flycatcher and Pacific slope flycatcher, where we really still are in the midst of trying to understand better what's going on with these birds in the southeast corner of the state, where we have this Great Basin influence into the high desert. And you have a lot of birds of kind of questionable identity, really, with the vireos and the flycatchers. There's potential issues of hybridization and introgression and real difficulty identifying them from vocalizations. And with the scrub jays, you know, California scrub jays are expanding eastward into some pretty arid habitats. So, so that's a complicating factor. So with all these three taxonomic pairs, we want to keep a close eye on them in the hopes of learning more about their true status. Let's see. Okay, so 14 new species over the past several years. At the same time, we have actually removed 2 species from the state list as a result of a process of going back and reconsidering, having formal reconsideration of some of the older records. What we've done is taken a look first at some of the species that were on our state list as a result only of site records without any photo or audio documentation. And so we've been going through some of these records, and as a result have voted down, have removed 2 species from the state list. The ringed storm petrel, which was a 2007 observation from a cruise ship, and the fork-tailed flycatcher, a 2010 observation from the North Coast. Both of these had written documentation. They were debated and narrowly accepted at the time. But since that time, the committee now, on looking back on it, has reconsidered those and determined that for such rarities, being first on the state list, and with the ringed storm petrel would have been, at the time, I believe, first in North America, that the documentation really needed to be of a higher level for us to feel comfortable with it. So those 2 removed. Likewise, Bell's vireo, our first 1980 record, was removed, leaving 1 accepted record. We looked at both of our painted red start records, ended up reconfirming 1 and not accepting another. And we reconfirmed a greater roadrunner record. So anyway, after all the additions and deletions, currently the state list is at 545 species. And you see the breakdown there, 10 site-only records, 4 sound records, but all others have photo or video documentation. And finally, I'll just close with a few kind of fun, interesting anecdotes. In May 2017, we had an unprecedented fallout of bar-tailed godwits on the coast, spanning much of the Oregon coast, but kind of clustered in the 2 areas you see on the map. At least 17 birds were involved, probably more. You know, as anyone who's seen some of Bob Gill's presentations in the past knows, you know, this is one of those species that has these long distance migrations over the Western Pacific. In this case, a storm system apparently blew a number of these birds eastward, and we had this unprecedented fallout on the Oregon coast. And then another interesting thing we've had to wrestle with is these cases where you get reports of the same species fairly close in time, but at distances away, where you're confronted with the question, okay, are we dealing with the same individual bird, or are there 2 birds involved? We've had 4 of these cases in recent years. We had Wilson's plover reports just 2 days apart, but 159 miles apart. We had a Hudsonian godwit 20 miles apart on consecutive days. We had Dixisel reports 9 days apart, but 127 miles apart. And then most recently, a painted bunting a month apart, but 1 in Corvallis, 1 in Salem. Are these the same birds or not? Well, when you have these kind of questions, you have to look carefully at plumage. And from doing that, we determined to pretty good satisfaction that the Hudsonian godwit was in fact the same bird. and that even the dickcissel appeared to be the same bird. It had some plumage abnormalities as well as on the hard parts on the bill that made the bird very distinctive looking. So we think 127 miles apart, showing up at 2 different feeders, and yet apparently the same bird. We think the same thing is going on with the painted bunting, but we're still assessing that. With the Wilson's plover, the photos were quite good, but we just couldn't tell for sure whether it was the same bird or not. But some fun stuff there. Another curious dilemma we had were this pair of birds, these 2 birds that showed up near Malheur, which we ended up calling hegrets because their identity could never be confirmed for sure, despite a great deal of documentation, a great deal of outside input. The best we could do in the end was say, it's probably some sort of hybrid mix between little blue heron and cattle egret, perhaps snowy egret. These are probably sibling birds from a particular hybrid mix nesting that occurred at or near Malheur. Best we can do, an interesting process, some interesting individuals there. And I'll just wrap up now and again, urge you to check out the webpage at some point to see how we're in the process of enhancing transparency and accessibility by making more documentation available. That's it. I'll wrap up and just say thank you to everyone from the OBRC. And if there's time for questions, I'll gladly take them.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Very interesting. I actually learned a lot from that presentation. We have a comment from John Dunn. The Oregon common scoter looks to be less than a full adult male, thus presumably a different bird from the Crescent City bird. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, as I recall, gosh, it's been some years now, but as I recall, we did determine that it was a separate bird, a different bird from the Crescent City bird. And I believe there were discussions with folks, who'd seen the California bird. And yeah, so I think that was determined pretty safely.
What subspecies are you all reviewing?
There's, I think there's about 10 or 12 of them. And the list, if you just look at the website, it's on the front of the webpage, that list. We're in the process of, we just started this and we're in the process of kind of revisiting that list. We've got a subcommittee looking at it, coming up with recommendations because it's challenging. We want these subspecies to be field identifiable so that it's realistic that we can deal with them. We also want them to be, things that are biologically meaningful, biologically of interest, just to make it worth our time, basically. So this is kind of a work in progress. I'd be happy to hear any input anyone has into the list that we've got, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I asked because I know the California Bird Records Committee has talked about that and thought about it for a long time and hasn't yet taken it up. But it's something that is definitely valuable for field identifiable subspecies.
Yeah, I think it's a valuable thing, but it's definitely also a time sink. I mean, we found, yep. So, Buick swan, Vega gull, those are some examples. These we've found tend to take a great deal more time and care and involve a lot more uncertainty in our eventual decisions is what we've found so far. So yeah, it's a hard call.
Yeah. And finally, I can't go without saying that for the Oriental greenfinch, the provenance issue, you were moderately satisfied it was probably a wild bird, which is about as close as you can often get on some of these issues of natural occurrence. And I just thought you'd put that exactly right. That's about as close as you can get and still say, yep, let's accept it. So that I wrote that down.
Yeah, that and the painted bunting with an adult male at a feeder. Extensive discussion there. And, sometimes I forget what our votes were on those birds. Sometimes you see what ends up being a lopsided vote, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the amount of care that went into the discussion. And hopefully that, by making some of our documentation and commentary more available, we're hoping to kind of, let the public in a little bit on kind of those difficult decision-making processes.
Yeah. Well, you said this was the first time that somebody had spoken about the Oregon Bird Records Committee at a WFO conference. So please, every year, every couple of years, please check back in, and I'm sure people would love to hear more. So please do.
We'd be thrilled to do that. Thanks so much, Steve.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks a lot to Jay and Joe, two more fantastic talks. The next science session will be at 3:30 this afternoon, so we hope everybody can join us then. John Harris, what's up next?
Oh, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Joe and Jay, for these interesting presentations. We'll be taking a break now, and our next program comes online at 2 o'clock, and that will be a talk by Lee Tibbetts on long-distance migration of buff-breasted sandpipers. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you around 2 o'clock.